Are you ready for the next drought? Brought to you by the European Commission, Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection.
When discussing drought, key questions tend to be asked over and over. For example, why doesn't there seem to be a successful, long-lasting solution to drought mitigation? Are governments doing enough of the right thing to tackle drought? Is there more reaction than prevention? Well, these questions will be answered with a focus on regional considerations on drought preparedness. We'll take a look at suffering regions in the Horn of Africa. I'm Smriti Vidyarthi Mohindra. Welcome to the second and final part of a conversation that aims to confront the challenges surrounding the drought issue, as well as look at successful community projects. But first, let's hear from the people who are directly affected.
Jamana to kan negara ya guru ke no jenga na gitu tiga gara guru na rupiah ke no jenga rupiah na kita patak dang so di dalam marta orang tini ke karang baran da tin tu amar igu mujibu tu bagu mujana na ngale nyanga nai ambere se dalu gram mususu
arad na amar tangi dia jok ne wala amanat gitu ya jok mamno ba jene pedor dua kita ting na aman tubul bitar ba ko bakar ba rangi perijo atau ba ke robo ariana ke wana manat ako atau yarta do ka perijo ba nang bar ya ma ader bang bar
ni perijo ngula potokai
pote anak ala kan alu turkan angol le bi turkan na apolonia haki pina kali mo.
Katika magonjwa tofauti tofauti ambapo imeambukizwa watu hapa, mimi najua wamepata juu ya maji kama typhoid na vitu vingine, maradhi vingine kadhaa, hiyo tumepata juu ya maji. Kwa hivyo hiyo maji tukipata maji aina hiyo tunaweza faidika, na pia wale watu watakuwa na mashamba kidogo kidogo kama mboga hivi watafaidika nayo, watafanya irrigation katika bama zao. Tukipata ambavyo ile kampuni anaweza kututolea maji mahali, kwa sababu kuna maji ya Turkana imetoka mahali ambavyo ikiwekwa tu pump itoke nje, watu wanapata jinsi ya kupanda. Kwa sababu hata tukienda sasa kando ya bahari pale, mahali bahari ilisonga, watu wamepanda mtama na sasa wamemea, ingine inatolewa na wanafuatana na bahari, jinsi bahari inaenda, bahari kisonga hao wanapanda.
Initially, projects were designed from top down, other than producing issues on the ground, then building to the top. So you cannot miss those gaps. So those are not problems, those are gaps that if the approach begins from on the ground, they can easily be, the project can easily go on well.
Akorna na ngoni amro ko ngoni tani nyetuko ka aku jurbo ngi bernie yedra idi atik tinga kipina kay tuno idi ubur ngarang barende ko ko yara nga jog hagu jurbo iki tinga kipi alwala ngban akorba na kita keter ba tamare atau ba keter ba ta Jakarta keter ba ko mangon atau ba keter ba gua ke jobar kareng amanat gua keter ba ko pana keter ba ngagipi
Communities tried to respond. If you ask what they did, they raised the alarm, they showed all the signs that, look, it is now, our flag is yellow. The pastoralist communities had started moving even earlier. because the first season had failed. So the second season in itself, they would not have waited. So they started moving. They were towards the dry season, dryland season, grazing season. So it was a pointer, that movement, and was pointing towards going out. Definitely the water pools, the wells were starting to dry, the surface water, and the hand-dug wells were literally becoming deeper and deeper. I know we raised, even with some partners, even our firm partners, and we said, look, this is happening. And they said, yeah, but it's a coping mechanism. If they are moving away to get to what is a coping mechanism. But some of these coping mechanisms are demeaning. It is right. Is it right that they should be moving out of this border as a coping mechanism when they should be getting water within their own reach, which is the same Kenya of 2030 that is supposed to have a vision that is saying you have clean and accessible water. So I was challenging them. It's a coping mechanism. Yes, is it the right one?
The voices of the people. Now we'll try and understand what policies and frameworks can be put in place by governments and how intergovernment engagement can help a policy. I'm joined by a host of panelists. From my extreme left, Luca Alinovi, a representative from the Food and Agricultural Organization in Kenya. Beside him, Animesh Kumar, a program officer at the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in Africa. Aldo Biondi, the head of the European Commission's Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection Regional Support Office. And beside me, to my immediate left, Ambassador Mahbub Malim, the Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, that is IGAD. Gentlemen, pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us. Drought, it's a key issue, and I'd like to start off this discussion by touching on the lives of the people that are involved. We've just listened to what civilians in Turkana here in Kenya are saying. And Ambassador, I'd like to start with you. A lot of them are saying that the government's not doing enough. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it could really be so. I'm not going to say the governments are doing enough 100%. There are things that the governments could definitely do better. There's no doubt about that. But coming from what we know now, the fact that over the last 40 years in Kenya, there has been about 8 serious droughts, to which all have been declared a national disaster. You look at the timeline between each. The first 20 years had 2, the second 10 years had 2, then the rest of the 4 or 5 all happened in the span of 10 years, which means the time span between successive droughts is lessening. Therefore, we know that now, and therefore we get into the next drought without necessarily disengaging from the response of the first one. We also did not understand the issue of intersectoral nature of the response mechanism for the droughts. That we know better now. And we also did not know a whole lot about the regional component, where member states of the IGAD region need to work together because the phenomenon has no boundaries. So bearing in mind out of the fact that we know all these things, and I think there are a lot of measures that are already in place that address these issues, I could say yes, we are now better prepared regionally than we were.
All right, Luke, I'd like to bring you in because you're a representative of the Food and Agriculture Organization. That is one of the NGOs that actively works on the ground. In your view, is enough being done? We've just spoken about how many years the region has faced drought. What is lacking, really?
Actually, it's a very good question, and it's very on the spot, in the sense that what we see happening is that we want to have more and more community involvement and more the community being at the center of it, which I think is happening quite well, honestly speaking, in the region at large, because most of the decentralization process happening in different countries in the region, which allow the community to get more and more in the discussion. If you ask, we are yet there, we're probably not yet there, but we are on the right path. I think that the governments of the different countries in the region are pushing for having this process happening. We need to create much more of that space. As the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, we follow up very closely the fact that all the farmers, the pastoralists, the fishermen, the people which are in this area need to have the support which is needed. And we do it through the government and through the institutions. And we see that the institutions are committed. In my function as a head of...
Let me ask you, institutions may be committed. In your view, do you think governments are committed enough?
I think that governments are definitely committed. If you're telling me if governments are achieving it, I think we are not yet there. But the worst thing that we can do is to question that process at the beginning when there is such a big change. The incredible role that IGAD is playing in this moment in trying to bring the government together with the community, with the local system. Obviously, we see a lot of effort happening in this country where passing in the decentralizing the agriculture sector to the county, it requires a lot of mechanism in place. There is a lot of discussion happening. Those are very healthy because they allow the country to evolve and move in this direction. So I'm very optimistic in that sense, but I don't see yet the results finalized because we are in the middle of the process.
All right, Animesh, do you share in the optimism? If we look at the Horn of Africa as an entire region, how would you describe the drought situation? Because we know it's bad. How bad would you say it is?
If you look at the droughts of 2008 to 11, so 13 million people got affected. Kenya alone had a loss of around $12.1 billion to the national economy. So something definitely went wrong. But from there we have taken off, and national governments have done a lot of efforts, undertaken a lot of efforts in terms of policies and institutions. For example, the Ethiopian government passed a multi-hazard disaster risk management policy last year. The Uganda government already has a national policy since 2010. Djibouti has it. Kenya is in the process of having one. So governments are doing, since the droughts of 2010-11, efforts to enhance the policy environment in place, which we expect in turn will enhance and strengthen the institutions in place. And the regional institutions like IGAD, and just a case in point, IGAD was the first regional institution in Africa to have a DRM program in place, the Disaster Risk Management Program of 2003, which was even 2 years before the global framework of Hyogo Framework for Action. So IGAD has taken some steps in this direction from the very beginning. We just need to, as both Ambassador and Luca pointed out, we need to move forward and accelerate this momentum.
Aldo, in your opinion, it's very well to have policies and frameworks. Do you think they're really working?
Let's say that we have seen significant progress vis-à-vis having national and regional frameworks and policy in place. Perhaps the big challenge we are facing now is to get into the implementation, efficient, effective implementation. So again, we have seen definitely progress. The last two crises, 2008-11 has definitely generated momentum. The momentum is still there after 4 years. There is a number of initiatives, as my colleague have said, there is a number of institutional and policy in place, but we need to get into the implementation. And perhaps the country, they have to take a bit more responsibility than they have done so far.
Ambassador, why do you think it's taking so long to implement these policies? Is it because the issue is far too complex, or because perhaps certain governments don't have the political will and they aren't prioritizing the issue? Because drought, we know, is nothing new. Why is it taking so long?
Well, as I said earlier, the drought is a slow onset phenomena. And therefore, and very easily predictable. But as I said, there are things that earlier on was not envisaged to be the real aspects of managing the drought that then were focused on. For example, a while ago, it was not really clearly understood how multi-sectoral this phenomenon should be, and how cross-regional it should be, for example. So when we, as a result of Heads of State's declaration in September of 2011, that said, and I quote, "Drought shall never turn into famine again in the Horn of Africa," and I was given the responsibility to coordinate that political statement. We asked people, what is the biggest problem? What is the biggest problems that we need to address? Mm-hmm. And we were told there are 4 areas. There's an area of coordination. We were told that we have never been coordinated in this in mechanisms to try and address drought issues. Secondly, we were told our information base was not one that's acceptable to everybody. And thirdly, we were told our response mechanism was not timely, not credible, issues like those. And lastly, we were told the issues of policy and research. nobody talked about money. Nobody even said that there are not enough resources. Everybody believed that there are resources, only that we do not follow the proper mechanisms that we require to get these resources together.
Right.
Now, as a result of that, we have had serious coordination framework, going on for a while. On 27th of this month, we have Heads of State Summit in Kampala. We were invited by President Museveni, and the topic is going to be to infuse much more energy into that coordination mechanism at the highest level.
All right. So indeed, there are challenges, especially when we're looking at the entire region. Aldo, you look like you'd like to comment.
No, I was just to build on this intervention and your initial statement. Drought is a very complex issue. What we have learned now is that drought happen more frequently, and they effect are more and more devastating because the vulnerability has increased. So there are also structural issues around, and I think one of the main lessons that we have learned from the recent crisis is that humanitarian and development need to get closer to address the root causes of the vulnerability, which make more and more devastating impact from the shock, drought or other. And this is a key, as you say, is extremely complex phenomenon, especially in the Horn of Africa, but we have to look and to have a better understanding perhaps of the vulnerability and to address the root causes. Government, development partners and humanitarians need to work together.
Okay. Animesh, on that issue of understanding, in our earlier discussion, I beg your pardon, last week, the issues came out about how governments and NGOs, for example, do not understand the very, very basic needs and the deeper needs of the people on the ground. It's like in Nairobi, we're coming up with policies, but we're not linking them to the real needs on the ground. What's your view on that?
I think one of the ways, and to also bring in what Ambassador pointed out about the coordination challenges and also the issue of linking policies with implementation. I think one of the key issues that we need to resolve first of all is to have the right information in place. If we have the right risk information in place, then only all the implementers start following the same risk information, and hence the implementation becomes much more coordinated than how it is as of now. And again, just to give an example, IGAD has recently come out with a disaster hazard maps and atlas, which is for the whole region, for the whole IGAD region, covering all the 8 countries. Then also each of the 4 countries, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya and Uganda, have recently launched, thanks to ECHO, a disaster loss database, which tells you who gets affected at what level, and if they get affected, what is the damage and loss. And we need such information in a much more coherent way so that the implementation becomes much more coordinated. And when we start having such information in place at one place, accessible to public, then only we become much more objective in our decision-making processes, and then only we become more integrated in terms of linking implementation with the policies.
Okay. Luca, earlier you mentioned that FAO and various other NGOs, I'm sure, are working with the people on the ground, building their resilience perhaps, and also encouraging them to help themselves. Do you think that the way forward perhaps is a bottom-up approach, or is a top-down approach working at all?
Let me start from something which has been somehow touched upon but is not really been addressed. In reality, most of the arid area or the semi-arid area in the region have received very limited investment in the last 40 years. And I think that is one of the biggest problems. If you look what happened, the geography of the drought in the last 40 years has changed dramatically. The area in Ethiopia, we saw this mega famine in the 74, 84, etc., are the area that nowadays haven't even fall apart in any form during all this crisis. And the reason is very simple. Huge investment in the agriculture sector, big action with the people on the ground, and they were able to create all these mechanisms which allows them to deal with the crisis in a different way. Unfortunately, in a number of other areas, those investment has been very limited. The things are changing, as I said before, so I'm optimistic, but a lot of these changes still have to happen. The infrastructure that need to be put in place in this area are much more costly, unfortunately, and much more complex because people move. And because people move, they need to have systems in place which are more complicated than what we are used to. And obviously, I agree with you with your initial statement in this last question, which is definitely we have to work much more with people. People knows what they need. We have also to stop with this kind of general perception that the people don't know what they need. Community are very clear what is needed. When Ambassador Malim, ourselves, and the governments of Kenya and Uganda were signing the agreement that we've seen before, it was because the people were very clear that they want to make sure that their animals are well treated from one side of a country and the other side of the other country to make sure that they can have their own economic return, which at the end of the day is very simple. And you're right in saying drought is very complex, but at the end of the day is also very simple. People want to make their decent life wherever they are, and if we are conditions which don't allow that to happen, we have to deal with those conditions.
Right.
And that requires a huge change in investment plan to make sure that in this area there is enough mechanism to deal with the type of complexity that we're talking about.
Ambassador.
Yes, I agree with what Luca says, but specifically the major infrastructure in the areas which are prone to drought bouts include opening up the region. Of course, taking due consideration into its environmental impact, so we don't displace people who would otherwise require part of the areas where infrastructure will fall for purpose of their survival. For example, if this is a rangeland and grazing reserve, for example. But opening up is really one of the interventions that will help in the long term. However, there is even a much more immediate need, that of developing people's resilience. And what does that mean? That means any intervention that you can design with the help of the people that will help people become a little bit much more better prepared to withstand a bit longer come the next bout of drought. And you do a bit next year until people are strong enough so that droughts become as common as winter is in Europe, so that it doesn't have to displace people. Now, to do that, you need to have a long-term investment plan across the board. You need to have communities prioritize their needs. You need to have a very serious multi-sectoral working style. You need to have serious focal pointship, both at the countries and at the regional level.
At this stage, do we have any of that or not?
Yes, we do. For example, in Kenya stands very high on the agenda when it comes to drought management. And Kenya recently formed the National Drought Management Authority, an authority that has technical expertise that is supposed to coordinate. And I hope that major programs that are resilience-oriented comes through that one single-stop coordination, and that the policies are put in place. So Kenya has, at the regional level, we have put one in place. We have what's called the DRISI framework that gives an opportunity for all the actors here, FAO, EU, ECHO, the UN, to work through and work with us. And we have the highest level, which is the General Assembly that brings together the heads of states and the ministers, and the regional level that brings all of us together, that plans all this. So the framework is completely ready. What we are working now on is long-term investments, and already we are getting some input from various financing agencies.
Right. Aldo, on the issue of long-term investments, when governments often get involved in projects, a lot of the time they are potential long-term solutions. But in case such as drought, do you not think that we do need immediate short-term solutions? Having listened to some of the people from Turkana, they want food and water tomorrow or today or even yesterday.
This is why short and long-term should coexist. As Luca said, the region and the arid and semi-arid land are suffered for not adequate investment. And then the few investment has been very separate, either long-term or very short-term, very much dominated by the humanitarian actors. The novelty or the main product, the main outcome of the momentum generated by the last two crises is this regional resilience framework. We have a process led by IGAD, and we have instrument in place, a country programmatic paper, a regional programmatic paper. Now we need to get into the implementation, and we need an alignment of humanitarian and short, medium and long-term investment need to be aligned to give an answer to the people who are suffering now and they want an immediate answer now. But again, we should really get out from the humanitarian operating on its own in a standing alone manner and the long-term development as well. And this is really the concept of resilience. Short and long-term instrument working together, tackling the root causes with a very short-term solution, medium and long-term.
All right, there's so much more to discuss and we'll come back to that issue. But first we've got to take a short break. Do stay with us, so we will continue this discussion on drought and its surrounding issues in just a moment. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, a reminder that the European Commission has for the last 7 years invested in projects aimed at mitigating the challenges brought about by drought. It's done this by funding particular organisations, and the discussion continues now with some of the stakeholders from various organisations. Let's continue that discussion, but I'd like to shift focus a little bit to some of the bigger challenges in the region. Ambassador, insecurity must play a big part in the drought crisis, especially when we think Ethiopia, Kenya, and our neighbouring countries, Somalia and even Sudan.
Yeah, that's correct. As I said, the real response mechanism for either preparedness for drought or mitigating drought or recovery from drought is peace and security amelioration, or really addressing the issue of peace and security. And here we have regional efforts where we have, through regular programs, we have peace and security components in it, where communities discuss, where early warning system in as far as pastoral-based conflicts are concerned is discussed. And we have a whole directorate in IGAD called C1, Conflict Early Warning and Early Response Mechanism, that again works very closely with FAO, EU, and the UN. That is used as a basis to get people to know that their fate is really joined, and that they need to access each other's resources as and when the situation calls for. So it is a big component of drought management, and really we see that so, and we try to work on it on that basis.
All right, there are a host of other challenges, but let's be a little bit optimistic and talk briefly first about what is working. Animesh, looking at the region as a whole, there must be certain things that do work in some countries and don't in others. But overall, in the fight against drought, what is working?
The IGAD comes out with the climate predictions for every 6 months, twice a year. It was held like end of February in Kampala. And the good news is that there's not going to be a drought, at least for the next 6 months.
Can we quote you on that?
So the rainfall appears to be normal or above normal for the Horn of Africa for the current prediction. So these are the information which is coming out, which is very good. And but that information then needs to be linked up, as you pointed out earlier. What are the people getting? What are the vulnerable communities getting? And then we need to link up the information coming out from the communities, from the vulnerable communities, to these overall short-term predictions to come out with some viable solutions in terms of implementation. For example, I would take the example of Ethiopia, where a very comprehensive risk assessment was done for the last few years, results of which are now put on a public website yesterday. It's now publicly accessible, and the government of Ethiopia endorses the whole information. So we need such kind of information so that we become more coherent in terms of how implementation works. And unless we have the right information, the early warning systems will not work. The early warning systems will not become contextualized to the real needs of the communities. And that's when we start contextualizing our problems to the needs of the communities. Just a case in point, we should not just talk about droughts when you talk about Horn of Africa. We had a big cyclone in Somalia in 2013.
Right.
We had floods in eastern Ethiopia in 2011. And all these problems sometimes are interlinked. So we need to have a more holistic approach, and some of the government policies which are coming out now are indications towards that.
All right, Luca, the Food and Agricultural Organization, which, I beg your pardon, is not an NGO, that organization, being a part of that, a representative of it, what can you say is working? Because earlier Ambassador said that there was a declaration or a statement that drought will not lead to famine. Are we improving in that sector? Because of course famine is mostly a result of drought.
I think we are, and I think we are, maybe not at the pace that we want, but we are. My office is also in charge of managing the resilience hub of FAO for the whole Horn of Africa. So in that sense, we are looking at this dimension of resilience across different parts of the region. And I have to say that I see quite a number of changes. We started talking about the role of community. I think it's quite important. We see this evolving quite rapidly. We did some exercise to learn more thanks to the support of the European Union and specifically of ECO, but that's particularly work with IGAD in this aspect. And we saw a number of lessons which are very critical. And I think it's very good the feature that we've been seeing before, because the people are asking very simple things that we can address quite rapidly. What we need to do is to link this addressing rapidly a small irrigation scheme that can help that man that was speaking from Turkana, while at the same time having the hydrological survey that tell us that we are not depleting the water tables of Turkana itself. So we need these two levels continuously working together. When I mentioned before investment, I want also to make it clear, I'm not thinking a highway, 3 lines in Turkana. I'm thinking those type of investment which are really hitting the need of people which are moving around.
On that issue of a highway, isn't that sort of investment also opening the gateway to northern Kenya? Because oftentimes people say Turkana, for example, is not part of Kenya.
Absolutely, and I'm not against it.
Okay.
The only thing I'm trying to say is that those type of family need an educational system which is able to follow people which moves. Right. And it's very complicated. They need an health system which is able to follow them. They need in some case safety net for the people which are drop off. And there is no way that there is a system that can sustain them. So there are very practical investment which can be quite rapidly put in place, are also part of a number of design in a number of countries. In Ethiopia there is a huge safety net system which is functioning quite well. In Kenya we are setting up a quite strong safety net system as well. There are systems that take care about this part, but requires also substantial investment to make smart use of water, which is unfortunately a limited, is limited in its own availability. We need to use the capacity of their productive sector, because these guys have been producing a lot of animal which has been commercialized. Are we getting the maximum out of it? Are we helping them to go back to the agriculture in a way which is sustainable for them? Right. Are we helping them to use the fishery in a proper way? Turkana is an incredible source of fish for a number of people, and they are not using necessarily at the best of their economic opportunity. So for me the point is very simple. At the end of the investment is very practical. It's not a very theoretical aspect of it, and requires a quite rapid moving in implementing, as it was mentioned before by Aldo and by the ambassador.
Yeah, let me go back to, okay, Aldo, go ahead.
I have to say that I fully agree, and our investment that you mentioned at the beginning, this 90 million that we decide to invest from 2006 until 2013 for disaster, for drought preparedness and mitigation, has produced a great deal of lessons learned and best practice for small investment that can have a huge impact also vis-à-vis the root causes. Luca has mentioned the safety net. It's critical, it's clear that we need roads, that we need more investment for health and for education. But the people that you have interviewed, that we have interviewed, they cannot wait for 20, 30 years to wait for the result. So safety net system, like many successful that we have seen also in the region, can definitely help these people in the short term while waiting for the effect of more long-term investment.
All right, Ambassador, can different nations suffering from, or regions in nations suffering from drought help one another, or is it too much of a personal problem to then lend a hand to your neighbor?
No, but let me tell you, it's not an option. The countries, particularly who are neighbors, like the 8 countries of the Horn of Africa, it's not an option that they have to work together on drought management.
Sure.
There's just no choice. There's no way that the vets in Kenya could think that they've eradicated a disease on the Kenyan border and stand at the border and hold their waist and think that's the end of the story. Because the next morning, 1 or 2 cows will come into the border and reintroduce the disease.
Right.
Exactly.
So regional programming in areas of intervention which will eventually affect the resilience capacity of the affected population must be done regionally. And that's why we're all working together. And that's why we have a regional structure that brings all these actors under one umbrella, and that has a presidential commitment to ensure that the member states respect what's agreed at that summit level. For example, like in Kenya, for example, among our 8 countries, I rate Kenya to be the lead in the kind of work that has been done in drought management architecture. But even in Kenya, you still see bits and pieces of resistance of compartmentalization, where somebody in Department X thinks that the work is being snatched away by some issues like those.
And I want to come to that because in our earlier discussion, with different stakeholders. I had somebody from the Transition Authority who was somewhat representing part of the government, and she said that here in Kenya there is a lot of confusion because we have different ministries, but both are mandated with the same thing, and we have an organization that's also responsible for the same thing, and there's a lack of coordination. How can we tackle that issue within countries? Because here on a bigger picture, you're saying that regions and neighbors do work together, but within individual countries, how difficult is it?
Well, within individual countries, there has to be an understanding that there's no way one department can deal with issues of drought management, response, preparedness, recovery, mitigation issues like those. That's why I was lauding the government's effort in having launched the National Drought Management Authority. So that's where issues of drought management has to rest. And those that authority has to be able to do resilience agenda issues on livestock, on crop production, on food movement, and issues like those. And I can assure you, having worked in the food security architecture and the disaster management architecture in Kenya myself for a long time, that structure exists. All we need to do is to respect it and to have the rightful authorities take charge when it is required, and to forget about this compartmentalization and tough of wars that civil servants sometimes become too myopic to come over.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm so disappointed to hear that the devolution group is talking about confusion. They should have. There's no confusion. Everyone knows what is supposed to be done.
One of the main products of this, from this resilience agenda, the regional and country framework that we were discussing before, earlier on, just aim at this, to overcome the siloization of the process.
Right.
So the main challenge, all is about multi-sectoral approach, multi-stakeholder, multi-layer approach. So we really hope that these frameworks that we have will contribute to this alignment of investment vis-à-vis an overarching goal.
Okay, all right. Well, let's just for a moment have a look at one of the features that have been prepared. And pastoralism is the main source of livelihood for the people, or at least most of them, in the Horn of Africa. And livestock are their prized possession. And many organizations, or rather any organization that wants to help create a sustainable livelihood for the people in the North, must take into account how livestock is managed. Here now is a case study of how funding and activities carried out by different NGOs supported by the EC have helped enrich the lives of a community in Uganda.
The border region of Uganda with Kenya is home to communities whose main source of livelihood is livestock. In search of pastures and water sources, they frequently cross the national border with their cattle and goats. With support from the European Union and the Humanitarian Aid Department of the European Commission, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the respective veterinary departments, and other organizations have come together to harmonize animal healthcare along the Kenya-Uganda border. A memorandum of understanding between the governments of Uganda and Kenya was signed in April 2013. This agreement commits both governments to provide harmonized animal healthcare services in the border regions.
The next step is now to implement, and the implementation entails development of a program that is going to look at specifics on how to coordinate and share information. Number two, on how to have common activities. For example, in animal health, how will they synchronize the various vaccination, treatment, information sharing, and surveillance?
National governments are not always in favor of free interaction across the borders, citing insecurity. Structures to enable easy coordination between service providers across the border are also lacking. But the benefits can be enormous, and the risks, such as spreading diseases, could be reduced.
It's not rocket science to know that you cannot treat a disease 5 kilometers from here and call it Kenya, and then assume that you're safe here and say you're not going to work with your Kenyans 5 kilometers away and you expect the disease is not going to get here.
But this common sense will not take root without political goodwill.
We will sign the MOU today. As IGAD representative here and being the custodian, I will make sure that that's implemented. Basic, first of all, here, then we'll use that to replicate it elsewhere.
The MOU signed a year ago must now be speedily implemented and the success replicated across the Horn and beyond.
Right, so that snippet there about political goodwill, how that plays a big role in fixing or at least attempting to the drought situation. Let's just still stick on the issue of the region, borders. Animesh, how in your view do droughts elsewhere affect neighbouring countries? We're talking issues of disease, of potential migration as well.
Yes, I mean, droughts don't respect political or administrative boundaries. It's needless to say that. And as Ambassador pointed out, like the animal movements, the livestock movement across boundaries also carry across diseases, and which are like one of the ramifications of the drought as well in some of the areas. So, for example, the droughts in 2008 to 11 was largely a result of the La Nina ocean current, which affected the whole region of the Horn of Africa. So unless we adopt a regional approach to solving such problems, we cannot really solve the problems in isolated situations. Mm-hmm. That's the point.
Okay. Look, I want to speak more about the people on the ground. How challenging is it? And first of all, is there a need to try and change their attitude? Because a lot of these people know one way and one life. But of course, organizations come on board and encourage them to, hey, look at this way of living. Maybe move away from your animals, or the water that you use to feed your animals, try use it for something else. How difficult is it to ask them to shift their attitude?
I would like to start back from a quote that Ambassador Marin was making before, which I really like. I think we have to start to, I mean, our aim is to start to think that drought as the winter in Europe. Mm-hmm. And I'll do a step forward, maybe because I'm just back from Dubai on another message. But in Dubai, drought didn't seem to bring famine. At least that's the impression that I got when I was there. So I think that we have to have that in mind to understand what there is behind. And the behind the story is that maybe I'm over-optimistic, although I did proper academic study, but I still think that the people have a lot of knowledge on what is needed. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that the people need to be changed or change behavior. We have to give the space of people to do the right thing. And that space of people has been incredibly proved as being the right way in engaging.
But let me just ask you, with adaptation,
Absolutely.
Because of course they're adapting to different things, do they therefore not need to change their attitude to an extent?
You know, there's very different, it's very different the concept between giving access to knowledge, mm-hmm. technology, information, rather than trying to transform behavior. Right. I think that the people understand very well where to get their benefit mm-hmm. if they have knowledge around. And I think that, and where I want to go is that we've seen in just this feature a very few seconds ago is really people of community on two borders realizing that if they change certain decision, everybody will benefit. And the beauty of what IGAD is doing through the Idrisi platform, which I really like, is really bringing the community discussion at all the political level, which require attention. Because we don't have to end in the mistake of thinking that the community are doing well while the government is wrong. Mm-hmm. That would be really a big mistake, because it's not that the point. The point is that the community, the voice of the community, need to raise at the level of the county, the country, the government, the regional entities, and IGAD is setting up a quite interesting framework to bring together all these different discussions where everybody should be accountable. And if you're ready to listen properly what the community needs, we will make the right decision. And we can help them, which we are trying to do, in helping them to take any possible option which is out there, right. which they may not be aware of.
Okay. Animesh, go
just
ahead. And then I'll come
to add to that, like it's we often talk about the indigenous knowledge, which we always need to harness, because as Luca rightly pointed out, the communities know what exactly they need mm-hmm. and what they want. But at the same time, we also need to provide a kind of scientific basis to the indigenous knowledge that the communities have, but because sometimes they do make mistakes. And we need to have a kind of a balance between the scientific information to the indigenous knowledge and mark a kind of a wave between the two. Mm. And the second thing is that the information flow from the communities to the central management system at the government level has become very much faster as compared to not very long ago. But the backflow of that information from the government centers to the communities is still an issue. That's something which the governments need to further strengthen.
Okay. Aldo?
The Memorandum of Understanding between Kenya and Uganda for the harmonization of the veterinary services is one of the products of such an investment, our investment in dealing with the community, mainly with the community, and it's possible, it's feasible. Now we really would like to see the same in other countries, for each and every country. We are talking about an homogeneous socio-economic area, despite the cultural, political, anthropological diversity, but a pretty homogeneous socio-economic area, and vibrant and viable. We have millions of animals which are exported to the Arab Peninsula, to the highlands of Kenya or Ethiopia every year. So, but we need to listen to the community, to work with the community, and the best practice now to be used to influence the decision-making process.
Ambassador, a lot has been said about listening and understanding the community. When it comes to creating policies and frameworks and memorandums of understanding, is it more about listening to experts, or are you taking that into account and listening to the community? What drives your agenda?
What we ensure to do is any policy or research out there has to be adaptive, in the sense that it has to be something that has come through some successive regimes of exchange of information with everybody and every stakeholder and every player, communities being the major player. And it must be something that can be taken back to them so that they can use it. I think this is the key. But coupled with that is also the appropriateness of the intervention you want to do at the community level, that you want to explain in terms of a resilience intervention. For example, if you are a community that lives in a rangeland and I want to make a community discussion on what it will take to intervene, probably the worst I want to do is hive off their land, for example, or try to interfere with the wet and dry season grazing regimes, for example.
Right.
And if a community was by the river, then probably what I want to do is see how I could provide what FAO does. For example, irrigation, potable pumps and issues like those. So appropriateness, timeliness of what we provide to communities as a means for strengthening their ability to cope in the next cycle of drought, which we explain in terms of resilience, is key. So this is where I think we require to commit to all of us and stay in a sustained manner. Governments, the region, and the international community and the UN.
All right, well, taking all of that into consideration, which is a lot, let's try now and answer that key question that we are asking today. Are we ready for the next drought? Luca, your response, it's not specifically a yes or no answer, but if you were to answer either yes or no, briefly, what would you say? Are we ready?
I would say no, but we are on the right track.
Okay, excellent. Animesh?
Yes, we are ready, but lots to be done.
Okay.
I think we are on the right track to address the unprecedented level of vulnerability that the arid land in the Horn of Africa has reached. Perhaps not yet prepared for the next drought, but maybe for the future one.
Okay, and Ambassador,
yeah,
yes
I would say we are much more prepared now than we were in 2011 when we had one of the worst droughts in 60 years.
And going forward, are we ready for the next one, whenever it might be, in your view?
That's what I'm saying. We are much more prepared now, and therefore, if there was one this year, probably will not do as best as we envisage to do. But eventually, we give ourselves a planning period of about 8-9 years, after which we will manage drought.
All right.
In the Horn of Africa.
Okay, so it seems we are to an extent ready, but in other words, we are not ready. At least we're on the right track. That's what we're saying. All right, Ambassador, I will just start with you now. And given this discussion, your final remarks about the drought situation.
My final remark is for the member states and the international community to buy in at very highest level on the ongoing regional initiatives, where we're calling for coordination, we're calling for better response, we're calling for better information agreements and collection and coalition and better research.
Okay.
So we can be together on this.
All right, Aldo, your remarks.
Let's say my wish is that humanitarian and development stakeholders alike, including government, work together.
Okay, excellent. And Animesh, what about yourself? What are your thoughts going forward?
We need to diversify because we can't solve droughts by just solving droughts. We need to adopt a multi-hazard approach towards solving the drought issue. And as we move forward towards the post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction, which is being adopted very shortly, we need to see how far the developmental processes can also lead to risk, as we saw in the case of Turkana. So we need to be very cautious while doing development and make it more risk sensitive.
Luca, you remain optimistic?
I remain optimistic, and I will continue to be. I think that, as I said, we are on the right track. We have to continue investing at the community level, working with people, working with the counties, working with the country, and working with the regional level in an integrated manner, bringing together humanitarian development to achieve the goal that drought become as the winter in Europe.
Okay, excellent. Ambassador Aldo Animesh, Luca, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. Pleasure to have you with us. All right, well, in conclusion, it is of course known that another drought, whenever it might be, is upon us, whether sooner or later. Now, projects are indeed in place to help better the situation, and the hope remains that communities, governments, NGOs and other organizations can work together for the betterment of those affected. So, in conclusion, are we ready for the next drought? Well, it seems the answer is both yes and no. It is, of course, a complex situation, but indeed efforts are being made to ensure more prevention than reaction. I'm Smriti Vidyarthi Mohindra. Thank you for watching. That's it for this two-part series on matters surrounding drought and the issues that come with it. Good night.
Are you ready for the next drought? Brought to you by the European Commission, Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection.